Amen. 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, we've been talking about entering in to people's lives and how it is that we have opportunities to enter in, and we talked about what that meant, to be involved in their life, to minister to them, and along with that, to be able to share the truth that we have found of the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ. We've talked about different ways that we can enter in or things that affect our entering in. And this morning we're finishing up here our series in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 10 through 12. And with the Lord's help over the next few minutes, I'd like to talk to you about our behavior while we are entering in. And the scripture there says in verse number 10, "Ye are witnesses, and God also, how holily and justly and unblameably we behaved ourselves among you that believe. As ye know how we exhorted and comforted and charged every one of you as a father doth his children, that ye would walk worthy of God, who hath called you unto his kingdom and glory." And so this morning we want to think about this truth that a major part of entering into people's lives has to do with what we do and not just what we say. Now, obviously this morning I'm not against confrontational evangelism. I believe that is imperative. It's a command of God that we would be going with the gospel and confronting people with the truth. That is, verbally speaking to them about the gospel. People are not going to pick up on the gospel by just observing our lives. That's the lifestyle evangelism philosophy, which says if I just live a good life and I serve the Lord and I'm faithful to the Word of God, then people will observe my life and they'll see that something's different and they'll come and they'll ask me what's going on and why I'm different. And I'm just curious, how many of you in your Christian life have had someone approach you and say to you, "I've been watching you for quite a while, and I've noticed that your life is different, and I'd like to know what is different about you because I want to have that." How many of you have actually had someone do that? Okay, we have 1, 2, 3, 4. All right, 5, 6. All right, 6, 7, half a dozen people. Something like that. Now, obviously, that's a wonderful thing, and we know our theme verse, "Let your light so shine before men, that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven." So we realize that our testimony is part of it, and every once in a while, we might have someone approach us and ask us. But if we are going to be witnesses to every creature, is it reasonable that we are going to wait for them to come and approach us about what they see different in our life? No, we're going to have to go with the gospel. We're going to have to initiate those conversations. However, it is important that our life would match our lips, that it would not just be what we say, but what we do that communicates the gospel. And that is the last thing in 1 Thessalonians 2 that the Apostle Paul deals with and speaks about how they were entering into people's lives in their behavior. Now, we notice several things in this passage. First of all, we see that there was an examination of their behavior, and there is an examination of our behavior. He uses the phrase in verse 10, "Ye are witnesses." And the idea there in verse 10 is that there are people who are watching. To be a witness, in this case, the way it's used in verse 10, is to be a spectator or someone who observes what is happening and can testify to it. They could give a testimony, "I saw this." Now, Paul says, you saw our life when we were there in Thessalonica, and you are witnesses of our life. So I want to remind you this morning that many people are witnesses to our behavior. Many people are watching. In fact, they're watching much more carefully than we think that they're watching. And it's always interesting to me how people who are unsaved, the Bible characterizes them as the world, People who are unsaved know what Christians are supposed to act like. And they are watching very carefully when they know that someone is a Christian to observe, okay, I know what Christians are supposed to be, so I'm watching to see if this person lives up to the expectation. Now, obviously, not all the things that they understand or think that they know are accurate biblically, but by and large, the world expects that a Christian's walk is going to match their talk. I think you would agree with that. People, when they hear someone say, I'm a Christian, then they say, okay, well, I'm going to watch. Because they are observing the life, and they want to know that the Christian is not just saying to do things, that would be hypocrisy, but that they're actually living in the manner that they have testified to, that the grace of God is real in their life. And it's ironic how the world knows what Christians are supposed to do and not supposed to do. And, if you've ever had an unbeliever say to you, I thought that Christians weren't supposed to do that. Boy, that's convicting, isn't it? And you think, oh, okay, yeah, that's right. I think people are watching more closely than I realize. Now, this fact that the world is watching and that they have an expectation concerning our testimony provides for us as believers both accountability and motivation. And what I mean by that is this should not be a burden to us to realize that people are watching, to realize that people are observing, but rather this should keep us accountable, and it should motivate us to be the kind of Christian that God would want us to be. It's good for us to have accountability, isn't it? It's good for us to know that there's people who are watching. If we didn't have any accountability at all, then we might just let some things slip because no one's really checking up. So it's good for us to have accountability. In fact, I encourage a lot of times, and I'll just say this again this morning, when you start a new job, and some of our young people may be getting ready to start jobs for the summer, some of you may be in the midst of changing jobs or changing careers. When you start a new job, it's good to go into that new job and plant your flag. Amen. And just let everybody know that, you don't have to be braggadocious about it or boastful, but just let people know that the Lord has changed your life, that you are a follower of Jesus Christ. And what that does is right away at the beginning, it lets everybody know, I want to be held accountable for being a follower of Jesus Christ. I want you to pay attention to my life and see that God's grace is real. Now, obviously, Christians are not perfect, and Christians can still sin, but it is good for us to realize that people are watching. For instance, your neighbors probably pay attention a lot more than you think that they pay attention. Your coworkers watch how you conduct yourself in the workplace. Your family members are observing how you're raising your family and the choices that you're making. And isn't it interesting how extended family that's not saved will sometimes test you to see? It's interesting how that will happen. They'll plan a family event on a Sunday, knowing that your obligation is, your priority is to go to church. And sometimes they'll do that on purpose, just to see, okay, how are you going to respond to this? What are you going to do? And they're always watching. They're always paying attention. There's an examination that takes place. He says, you are witnesses. And what were they witnesses of? According to verse 10, how we behaved ourselves among you that believed. And that idea of behaved ourselves means that all of us have a story that is being told. And that story is being communicated by our conduct, our attitudes, our treatment of others, our words, our work ethic, our priorities, all the things that make up our life. People are observing, they're watching, and that is telling a story to them. It's communicating something to them. So realize this morning that people will be watching. People will be examining your behavior. I'm convinced of this, that sometimes unbelievers will push the button of believers on purpose and try to provoke them, to get a rise out of them, just to see if they can get them to respond like everybody else. I'm convinced of this, that they would feel better if Christians would run with them to the same excess of riot as the scripture says. The things that you used to do as an unbeliever, that you would just run after those things, would make them feel better. So they might try to put you to the test. They might try to poke and prod a little bit, and many times they're examining, testing, okay, do you really believe the things that you say you believe? Now, not only is there an examination of our behavior, but there's also an expectation of our behavior. And he mentions in verse 10 the things that were characteristics of their action or the way that they behaved themselves there in Thessalonica. And it's a good reminder to us that not only are other people watching, but also God is a witness. Do you see that in verse 10? Ye are witnesses, and God also. God is watching, and he's paying attention to our behavior. And there are expectations that God has set forth in his word about our behavior. And when we are consistent in those areas, it has an impact on our testimony or on those who are observing our life. 3 things are brought out in verse 10 about the behavior of Paul and his mission team, which I believe ought to be characteristics of our life as well, things we ought to keep in mind as we are entering into people's lives. First of all, he uses the word holily, or he speaks about their holy behavior. And holiness is something that God expects of every true believer. God wants us to live a holy life. 1 Peter chapter 1 and verses 15 and 16 says, But as he which hath called you is holy, so be ye holy in all manner of conversation, because it is written, Be ye holy, for I am holy. All manner of conversation means every part of your life, every part of your conduct, every facet of your behavior. You should be aware and you should be seeking to live a holy life. And how do we define that holiness? We define that holiness as being like the Lord. So we want to be like Christ in every area of our life. Now, obviously, that's something that we're striving for. That's something that we have not reached the pinnacle of. That's something that we are trusting God's grace to continue that work in our life. But holiness or holy behavior could be seen as our relationship with God. Holiness is how I relate to God. And then that affects how I relate to the world. Because my relationship with God is a particular way, then my relationship to the world, to those who are around me, is likewise going to be affected. And God desires for you and I to live a holy life. He wants us, another word that goes along with this idea of holiness is, he wants us to be separated from the world, or separate from the world. He wants us to live in such a way that we are different. We are separated from sin and to God. And the idea of separation or holiness is that we should be known for eschewing evil. Like Job, God called attention to Job and said he's a man who eschews evil. He's a man who does not want to have anything to do with evil things. And that's the negative side, or the part that we separate from. And the positive side, the part that we separate to, is that we desire to be like Christ in all things. And so he says, you looked at our life, you saw how we lived, and you saw that we were living a holy life. Now, that's quite a claim. That's quite a profession for Paul to have that confidence that he could say, you saw the difference that Christ made in our life. And I want to challenge you with that thought. Do the people that you work with, the people in your neighborhood, do your family members who are not saved, do they recognize that there is something different about you, that you desire to live for the Lord? Or have you allowed your testimony to be swayed or to be affected so much that you just want to be accepted by other people, and so you're going along with things that everybody else is doing? You're talking like other people, you're acting like other people, and you're not allowing holiness to be a part of your life. And that's obviously not going to help your testimony with other people. So he says, you see our testimony, you see your witnesses of our holy behavior. Not only that, but he says in verse 10, your witnesses of how justly we behaved ourselves. And if holiness speaks about our relationship to God and then how that affects our relationship to the world, justice or just behavior speaks about our relationship to our fellow man. It speaks about how we relate to those who are around us. The idea of just behavior or acting justly is to be equitable and righteous in the way that we treat others, in the way that we interact with others. And this is going to have an effect on our business life, our family life, our social standing, our dealings in our neighborhood, all of these sorts of things, the way that we conduct ourselves in regards to how we relate to other people. So this is going to affect things like our responses to mistreatment and what we do when people hold us to a different standard. Do you know, as Christians, people hold you to a different standard than everyone else. And that can be irksome sometimes to Christians. You think, why are they're allowing for that in someone else, but when that happens to me or in my life, they call me on it. That's not fair. That's not right. No, that's part of being a Christian. And he says, you recognize our holy behavior, but you also recognize our just behavior. We could put it this way: when you love God with all your heart, that's holiness. That results in loving your neighbor as yourself. The first and the second great commandments. It is impossible to love God properly without also loving your neighbor. If you're not loving your neighbor, if you're not characterized by just behavior in your relationships with others, it is because there's something lacking in your relationship with God. And so he says, you recognize how holy we were. You recognize our just behavior, the way that we related to you and to others around us. So this can be, by the way, an indicator, or, on your car you have dummy lights, they call them. The things that come up on the dash, like if you see the oil light, that's really bad. Turn your car off, all right? Your car is about to melt down if it didn't already. Once the oil light comes on, that means you lost oil pressure and your engine is about to melt down. It's like, hey, pay attention to me. Shut this car off. So we have some things like this. And when you have a lot of problems in your relationships with other people around you, it's an indicator. It's an indicator light in your life that's saying, hey, something's not right with your relationship with God. You need to look at your relationship with God, because there may be some things. Now, I recognize, as Christians, we could be facing persecution, and this could be because of our righteous behavior, but we need to evaluate and make sure it's not because we are treating others in a way that is un-Christ-like. So he says, you recognize our holy behavior and our just behavior, but also he uses the word in verse 10, unblameably. How unblameably we behaved ourselves. And unblameable behavior, this word has the idea of not being able to be grabbed a hold of. And it's the idea of an accusation can't stick, because your testimony is such that if somebody said, oh, so-and-so did this, people who heard that would say, no way. I don't believe that. That's not how they are. That's not consistent with who they are. So unblameable behavior has to do with our relationship to questionable things. Things that others may disagree on, things that people might have different opinions about, but we say, for the sake of my testimony, I want to make sure that I have a very careful relationship with questionable things. So there's things, for instance, that I absolutely will not involve myself in. I wouldn't say that I have chapter and verse that they're wrong, but I'm not going to involve myself in them because I believe that it would create questions about my integrity or about my motivations. And so I say, I don't want to be a part of that because I don't want to accidentally soil my testimony through things that are questionable, things that I'm not sure about that. It'd be better to be on the side of, I want to be unblameable. Do you know this morning, it's our responsibility to live in such a way that our message is not compromised by the choices that we make in our life? Amen. We don't want to give people, especially people that we're trying to share the gospel with, we don't want to give them a reason to question the gospel or to question whether the gospel is true. And so there's going to be some things that we're going to say, I'm going to stay away from that. I'm not sure if that's right or wrong, but I'm not going to involve myself in that because I don't want to compromise my testimony. Ephesians 5, verses 15 and 16 says this, "See then that ye walk circumspectly, not as fools, but as wise, redeeming the time, because the days are evil." And to walk circumspectly means that you're paying attention. We've all seen the videos that go around on social media of people who are walking while they're texting or surfing the internet on their phone, and they run into something. I saw a video that was going around a couple years ago, somebody doing that, and they fell right into a water fountain, and it got caught on the security camera. That's not walking circumspectly. That's not paying attention. That's not being alert. As believers, we need to, as we are walking through our life, as we are making decisions, we need to be very circumspect. We need to think about the choices that we're making. Okay, what is this going to communicate to others? How is this going to affect other people's view of the gospel? What is this going to do in regards to how people are going to think about Christianity and the Bible? I need to think about my testimony in this way, and I need to make sure that my behavior is unblameable. Now, for our light to shine the way that it ought to, it means that men need to see our good works and glorify our Father which is in heaven. And so there ought to be a difference in our life. This difference is not like, hey, look at me, look how good I am. This difference is, look at the grace of God and look at the change that God has made in my life. We all ought to be seeking to live in this manner to highlight the grace of God, or to help others see that the grace of God is real to us, that God has made a difference. And, we can call attention to this when people say things to us about our character or about the way that we act or live differently than other people. We can immediately give the credit to God. And we can say, hey, that's definitely the grace of God at work in my life. I wish you could know what I was before I got saved, before I met the Lord, and I wish you could see the change that has happened in my life. That's all because of God's goodness and God's grace in my life. And we can also be honest with other people, even with unbelievers, about our imperfections. And, I think it's helpful when you fail, when you recognize that you have publicly sinned. Maybe at work you lost your temper, or in an interaction with a coworker you were rude. It's entirely appropriate to come back and to own that as your sin, and to say, hey, I need you to forgive me. I didn't behave in the right way, and I'm a Christian, and I know that I shouldn't be acting that way. I need you to forgive me, and I need you to understand that God has already forgiven me, but I need to make things right with you. And I'm telling you, that's going to go a long ways towards people recognizing the power of God in your life. Because people don't apologize generally for things that they've done wrong. They don't admit to failures or to sins in their life. And that ought to be a characteristic of a believer, that we are honest about the things that we fail in, and when that affects others, that we would ask forgiveness of them. So we see that there is an examination of our behavior that's taking place. There's an expectation of our behavior that God has, and also that the world around us has. But then notice in the balance, in verses 11 and 12, the exhortation that can come from our behavior. And verses 10 through 12 really go together. He's talking about this was what we were like, and this is what we said to you. And this is how we treated you. This is how we exhorted. That's the word that he uses in verse 11. As ye know, how we exhorted and comforted and charged every one of you as a father doth his children, that ye would walk worthy of God who hath called you unto his kingdom and glory. And the behavior of the apostle, of the mission team, and what they were teaching are linked so carefully together. In other words, their testimony gave credibility to what they were teaching or what they were saying. Now you'll notice he uses several words in verses 11 and 12. First of all, he uses the word exhortation or exhort. And the word exhort means to call someone near. It has the idea of calling other people to join you in walking and living for the Lord. It's the idea, okay, God is at work in my life. Hey, come along with me. Let's walk together. Let's serve the Lord together. Let's follow after the will of God together. Let's live for the gospel together. So exhortation, the very nature of exhortation means that you've got to be living a certain way before you can invite other people to join you. Exhortation is not, hey, you, get over there and do that. Exhortation is, hey, won't you come and join me as we do this together? Do you see the difference between those two things? So if our behavior is what it ought to be, then we can say to someone else, hey, I've experienced the grace of God, and I'd like for you to experience the grace of God. And if our testimony is right, they're going to say, I can tell that you've experienced the grace of God. I can see that there's a difference in your life. And you know what? I want to have that. I want that to be true in my life. It's impossible for us to exhort others without living consistently for the Lord. If we don't have the kind of life that says the gospel has made a difference, how are we going to invite people with the gospel? If they say, well, you're just like everybody else. You act exactly like everybody else around at work, in the neighborhood. You're no different. What do you have to offer to them at that point? And so as believers, if we have the right kind of testimony, we can exhort others. We can challenge them. We can ask them to step forward. Not only exhortation, but he mentions in verse 11 that they comforted. They comforted. And comfort is encouragement or consolation. And when you realize, as we enter into people's lives, especially as we're working with new believers or people who've made a profession of faith, it's incredible to me how when someone gets saved, the enemy just attacks them. And they need so much comfort. They need so much care. And the idea here is of like the way that my wife might respond if one of our kids gets hurt and comes to her for, help. And usually the help is not so much related to, I have a life-threatening wound and I'm about to die and I need you to take me to the hospital. The help is more like, I need somebody to notice that I got hurt and to clean up my wound and to kiss it better. Kisses, mama's kisses always make everything better somehow. And so that's what they want. They want to be comforted. Many of the people that we work with, as we're entering into their lives, they're facing temptations. At times they're failing in living for the Lord. Maybe they got saved and then they've made some wrong decisions and they're weighed down by the fact that they know, I got saved, but I didn't do the right thing. And now what? And what does that mean? And a lot of times people need some comfort. They need someone to come alongside. So many times what people need more than chiding and more than, hey, you better get busy doing this, is for someone to come alongside and pray with them and show some empathy for the situation that they're facing while at the same time encouraging them to live for the Lord. And this is, exhortation and comfort really go together, because as we're calling people to live for the Lord and we're saying, hey, this is the change that God has made in my life, that gives them hope. And they say, okay, all right, if God has changed your life, he can change my life. But then when they encounter those road bumps, when they go through those struggles, we can be there with them to comfort them, to remind them of the forgiveness of the Lord, to encourage them, to say, hey, come on, you can do it. Come back to the Lord. Don't stay away from him for too long. Come back to the place where you know that you ought to be. And we have a responsibility to exhort and to comfort. And all of this is based on our own testimony, on our own behavior. Exhort, comfort, and then he uses the word in verse 11, charge. We have exhorted, comforted, and charged every one of you. And to charge, this is the idea of sharing your own personal experience to encourage other people on. When you charge someone, it's the idea, there's a personal element to it. It's like saying, this is what God did in my life. And you know, it's helpful to be able to look at someone who's struggling in some area of sin and say, you know, I remember when I struggled with that. I remember when I was grappling with learning how to read my Bible every day and spend time with God. And I remember the struggle that was for me. And I remember how I grappled with that. And I remember then how God worked in my life and some things that I learned that helped me to become victorious. And you know what? When people hear that it's not just theory, but that there's people who've been through this as well, and they've seen some victory, that God has brought them to the other side, and now they're experiencing that victory. That is a charge to other people. You and I should be able to speak about the reality of walking with God as we minister the word of God to other people. In other words, it's not just sharing with other people, hey, you're a sinner and you need to be saved, and Christ died for your sins, and you need to repent and believe the gospel. I mean, that's the good news, right? That's a wonderful thing to share. But it's also important to be able to say to people, you know, I spent some time with the Lord today. I was praying for you and for your needs. The Lord worked in my life in this way. I was praying about this, and God answered my prayer. I was confused about something, and the scriptures gave me direction. You say, can you talk to unsaved people about things like that? You certainly can. Amen. Because it helps them to understand that God is real. That God is not just a figment of someone's imagination. By the way, because of the way that God created us, the way that we are made as human beings, every person deep down inside wants to have proof that God is real. They want to know that there is a living God that you can have a relationship with. Now, I understand that because of sin, some people are resistant to that message. But deep down inside, the yearning that every human being has is make it make sense. Help me to understand life and eternity and my relationship with God. And when they encounter someone who can give a genuine testimony about walking with God, that makes a difference in people's lives. They may not agree with you. They may not get saved right at that moment, but they are going to remember, I met someone who talked about their personal relationship with God. And that's what it means to charge others. Exhort, comfort, charge. And then he compares this in verse 11 to a father exhorting, comforting, and charging his children. So a father has a responsibility to deal with his children, and in this way to exhort, comfort, and charge them. So think about this. As a father has responsibility, a father has experience, and a father has hopeful anticipation. Think about those three things. First of all, a father has responsibility. So 4 of my children are sitting here in the auditorium, and as a father, I have a responsibility to them. If I see something in their life that needs to be addressed, that is my responsibility. It's not something that I can ignore. It's not something that I can say, well, I hope my wife will talk to him about that. It's not something that I can be like, well, I hope that one of the other people in the church will notice that and we'll talk to them about that. If I see it and I realize that it's something that's lacking in their life, then I have a responsibility to go to my children and to sit down with them and say, hey, let's talk about this. Give me some perspective. What are you thinking? I'm noticing some things. Tell me what's on your heart. I have a responsibility. In like manner, you and I have a responsibility to enter into the lives of the people that God brings across our path. God is giving us the privilege of working together with him, which will be interesting because that's the theme of the message this morning in the morning service. But God brings them into our life, and now I have a responsibility to step forward and to enter into their life. So like a father, I have responsibility. The second thing that a father has is experience. So, with my children, I can say to my children, I've been through that. I remember when I was learning to drive. I remember some of the fears that I had. I remember some of the things that I struggled. I remember some of the skills that I had to learn. And I want you to learn those same things. So now, as a dad, and this is, more of a mundane, worldly example, but okay, let's learn how to drive. Let's learn, I'm teaching my son how to drive a manual transmission. And he's doing great with it, all right? He's doing a terrific job. But it was a little frustrating, wasn't it, at first, Isaac? And I remember that I'm gonna use him as an illustration, and he'll be all right, okay? So I remember one of the first days that I took him out driving on the road with the manual transmission, and we were across the street up here, and he was going up the road, and then there was a car in the middle of the road, and he stopped to let the car. They were backing out, and he had to stop. And then he tried to restart the car, and it was a little bit of a hill, and he was stall. And the guy who was in the other car actually got out of the car and walked over. Are you guys okay? Is everything all right? I said, he's learning to drive stick. And the guy's like, oh, man, hang in there, buddy. I remember when I learned to drive stick. I stalled out so many times, and it was so embarrassing. You're doing great. And he gave him some encouragement. And that was kind of cool. And then Isaac and I figured out he was in third gear and not in first gear, which makes it hard to start on a hill, all right? So valuable lesson. But you know what I could share with him? I remember doing that. I remember stalling out multiple times in traffic and thinking everybody's honking at me and getting irritated and I'm getting flustered. I remember what that's like. That's part of learning to drive a manual transmission, and I can empathize with that, and then I can say, hey, stay calm, stay cool, it's all right. You're going to get it. It's going to be fine. And he's getting it. He's figured it out, and now he can drive a manual transmission, which I think is a good thing to learn how to do. I think you should all learn to drive a manual transmission. All right. So a father has responsibility, but a father has experience. Now, spiritually, we have some experience, don't we? We can say to others, yeah, I can empathize with that. I remember, when I was struggling with that sin. I remember how difficult it was. Or maybe I'm still struggling with that sin. I still grapple with that. That's still something that is a reality in my life that I have to pay attention to. And these are some things that I do. A father has experience to be able to say, this is what I've lived and this is what God has done. Father has responsibility and a father has experience. But third of all, a father has hopeful anticipation. As a father is instructing his children, he's not thinking, my kids are going to be failures. They're just going to fall flat on their face. No, a father is thinking, my children have so much potential. If they could learn how to do these things, they're going to go far in the world. A father has hopeful anticipation of what he can communicate to his children. In the same way, spiritually, as we minister to other people, we're not thinking, oh, these lousy people, they're just going to fall flat on their face and they're never going to serve the Lord. Nobody's ever going to get saved, like the Jonah attitude. That's not the way that we should be responding to people or inputting into their life. We should have an element of hopeful anticipation. Think about what God can do with someone when they get saved and their life starts to change and you realize there is so much potential for God to use this person. Hopeful anticipation of where God is taking us. This is, charity believeth all things, hopeth all things, endureth all things. Charity has hope that people can change by the power of God. And this is the anticipation that a father has. This is the anticipation we should have as we minister to others. What is the intended goal? It's found in verse 12, that ye would walk worthy of God, who hath called you unto his kingdom and glory. So Paul says, we live this way, and we responded to you in this way. We reached out to you in this way because we wanted you to walk worthy of the Lord. The goal is we want to see people become like Christ. We want people to experience real salvation, to experience the power of the Holy Spirit in their life so that they could also become like Jesus Christ. You and I want to live in such a way that if other people followed our example, they would be following Christ. We want to be able to say, like the Apostle Paul, follow me as I follow Christ. But now think about your life. Is that your life? If people followed you and did the things that you did, acted the way that you did, had the same attitudes as you did, would they be emulating Jesus Christ? Or would they be emulating your old man? And that's the question that we have to answer as believers as we are entering into people's lives. Now, with that in mind, I want to talk for just a few minutes about how to have a spiritual conversation before we conclude the Sunday school hour this morning. It's interesting how the morning message, I didn't necessarily plan for this to coincide, but the morning message this morning is going to be like a natural follow-up to the things that we're going to talk about here. And it's interesting how the Lord put all of that together. But many of you asked, okay, Pastor, I hear what you're saying. We want to have spiritual conversations with people. How? How do I have a spiritual conversation with people? Well, I think we need to back up and first ask, how do you have a conversation with people? And ask yourself the question, how do I actually engage someone in a conversation? So this might be just more of a worldly skill that you need to develop. By the way, you say, well, I'm not wired that way. I'm just not the kind of person who converses with other people. I'm not comfortable with that. But you can. So it's a skill that is learned. It doesn't really come natural to many people. It's a skill that you can learn to converse with other people and to engage them in conversation. But it requires a certain amount of stepping outside of yourself and looking on the things of others and showing an interest in others. And really, so that's the most important thing that I could tell you about conversation with other people. Conversation, a lot of people are nervous about conversing with other people. Conversation is not so much about the things that you're going to say to them as it is, if you just back up a little bit, in showing an interest in other people. So many people are living their lives kind of like, I think most of us feel this way, like nobody really pays attention to me. Nobody really notices me. I'm not that significant. And so if you can, as you interact with people, especially people that you're meeting, if you can show sufficient interest in that person that they walk away from that interaction feeling valued by you. In other words, you were interested in them as a person, and you were curious. Curiosity is a big part of this. You were curious about who they were and what their priorities were, and you engage them in conversation. This is a big step towards having a genuine conversation with another person. And so, you could have these kind of conversations in the grocery store, at the gas pump. You can have these kind of conversations in your neighborhood or with family members. At work, you can have these kind of conversations. It's absolutely possible to have conversation. So before you can have spiritual conversation, you actually have to have conversation. So you got to make that step first. How am I going to converse with other people? This is just like normal stuff that people converse about or talk about, like the weather, what's going on in the world. So, do you have family? Tell me about yourself. Where did you come from? This is, we live in a really multicultural area, so this is an interesting, although sometimes, people get a little edgy when you ask them where they're from originally, so you have to learn how to ask that question without sounding like you're probing, to find out if they're here legally or something like that, all right? So that's not the goal. You want to show an interest in who they are, or, obviously, a lot of times you're going to meet people and you're going to say, okay, well, they're different. They definitely are different than I am, and they must be from somewhere else originally. And so you can ask questions like that and just engage in conversation. So now, from there, you can move to spiritual conversation. You generally are going to have to start with conversation before you go to spiritual conversation. And now let's just talk for a couple of minutes about having a spiritual conversation. How do you do this? Well, in the conversation that you have with someone, You listen for clues from the way that they speak. You listen for clues about spiritual interest or curiosity that they may have. So as people begin talking about themselves, where they come from. Okay, let me give you an example. And this was not a conversation that I was able to capitalize on. But the other day, I was at the store with my kids, and I was wearing a polo shirt with the name of our church. And I finished my transaction. My kids were at the register, and I stepped away over to the side waiting for them, and I overheard two cashiers talking to one another. And the one cashier says to the other one, I haven't been to church in a long, long time. And the other cashier said, yeah, if I went into a church, I think lightning would strike the building and the place would burn down. And the other cashier said, well, last time I went to church, the pastor told me I was evil and told me that I shouldn't come back. And that was about where, as obviously it's not the kind of thing that I can just walk up and say, hey, what's going on here? I want to talk to you about this. But if, I'm sharing this with you, if they had said one or more of those things to me, this is a great opportunity to have a spiritual conversation. Because they were in their conversation with each other, they were saying things to each other that were sharing some of the spiritual things that were going on in their life. And they were indicating a spiritual interest. There's something that's going on in their life. There's a regret that they don't feel welcome in a church. There's a regret that there's some things in their life that make them not feel welcome. So when you listen for clues as people are speaking, you're listening for things like their identity. Who do they believe that they are? How do they describe themselves and their interests in the world? You're listening for, okay, who is this person? And these are normal things. Once you get past the facade of the easy banter back and forth, hey, how about the weather? Boy, how are your allergies? Did you notice the economy? Boy, these mortgage rates are crazy. All right, so you get to the place where you're like, okay, now let's talk about who I am. And people start to unload a little bit about who they are. They also will begin to talk about where they came from. And it's interesting, as people think about their origin, sometimes they'll talk about their culture, their country of origin. Where did they grow up? What was their family like? But underneath all of that is really the question of origin, like where did all this come from? And what is it all about? And so, as people are talking, sometimes they'll make reference to that. They'll say things about how they, the Lord had some kind of a purpose. Or, and people, they will mix these. Have you ever heard these little spiritual cliches that they mix into their speech? And they don't even necessarily know what they mean or what they're trying to say, but they've heard other people say it. And so, they'll say, yeah, the Lord is just good all the time. You know what? The Lord is good all of the time. That's a clue. There's something that's there. You can capitalize on that if you're bold enough. Purpose, they'll speak about their purpose. Why am I here? What is my purpose for living and being? And they'll say things like, there's got to be more to life than just going to work. I just think that there's got to be more than just, it seems like life is so short and it seems like life's got to mean more than just making a retirement and getting some money in the bank. I mean, people will talk like this. And this is a great segue into gospel themes. They'll also talk about their destiny. And this is something, where occasionally, especially when someone close to them dies, or they're going through a season of loss, or they're facing a sickness that is life-threatening, they sometimes start thinking and even talking about, what happens after a person dies? I wonder, is this life all there is? You just go in the grave? Or maybe they'll express it that way. Well, I'm pretty sure you just go in the grave and that's it. And you know what? When people open up and they share something about that, it's a great opportunity to probe their spiritual understanding. This is what it means to have a spiritual conversation. Now, the reason I say that we can have spiritual conversations is because we are spiritual beings. God made us in his image We all have a spirit. Now, if you're saved, your spirit is alive to God, but if you're unsaved, your spirit is dead in trespasses and sins, but you still have a spirit and you're still a spiritual being. And because you're a spiritual being, that's a component of people's lives. They don't easily open up about their spiritual side, but everyone is spiritual. Therefore, you can have spiritual conversations with absolutely anyone. So you're going to listen for clues when the other person is speaking. A second thing that is helpful is you can ask questions that will probe their understanding and their interest. And there's a lot of questions that you could ask. I'm not going to give you all of those questions. I want to give you 4 possible questions that you could ask at the appropriate time in a conversation. These questions may help you to take another step and to have a deeper spiritual conversation. You can ask someone, do you consider yourself to be a spiritual person? And brace yourself for the answers that you'll receive. When you ask this kind of a question, the answers you may get may range everywhere from, I was raised in a Christian home and I still believe the Bible is true, all the way to, I've really gotten involved in witchcraft and Far Eastern religions, and I'm kind of into meditation and yoga and stuff like that, and I'm really interested in that. So, there's a wide range of things. Or they may just say to you, I'm an atheist, I don't believe in God at all, and I'm just not a spiritual person. It's a pretty rare answer, but every once in a while you'll get one like that. But that's a great beginning question to ask someone. Do you consider yourself to be a spiritual person? And just listen to what they say. As you listen to what they say, you're going to have opportunity to ask following questions about their point of view. Oh, you said this. I'm curious about that. Why do you feel that way? Or what led you to that conclusion? And the more that people unpack about their spiritual understanding, the more that you will begin to realize, okay, this is where they're coming from, and you'll have an opportunity to be able to address those things with the truth. The second question you can ask people is, have you ever read the Bible? You'll be surprised how many people will say to you, yeah, I have read the Bible. Or, I started reading it. I was curious about the Bible, and so I picked up a copy and I started reading it, or I started listening to it online, and I got kind of, I was really interested there for a while, and then I got kind of lost. And I usually say, were you by chance about in the middle of Exodus or the beginning of the book of Leviticus? And they'll be like, yeah, how did you know? Funny you should ask. All right, so you can ask people, have you ever read the Bible? That can lead to a really interesting conversation. Third of all, you can ask people, now, especially if you know they don't go to church, and you're already aware they don't attend church, but you can ask them, say, when you were a kid, did you ever go to church? Because a lot of times people will say, oh yeah, when I would go to visit my grandma, she would take me to church. Or, every summer I would go to vacation Bible school. And so then you have the opportunity to talk to them and say, well, what was that like? And, what did you think of church? Do you ever miss going to church? Or is it something that you think, like, when your kids get a little bit older, that you should bring them to church? So you have lots of follow-up questions, but it begins with, did you attend church when you were a child? Because we live in America, a lot of people did attend church when they were children, and they can talk about that experience. Fourth question. And you have to be careful about when to ask this one, but you can ask people, do you ever think about death and what happens after you die? And a lot is in how you ask this question. At the right moment, you can ask this question, and it can be lighthearted, or it can be very deep and serious, depending on the circumstances surrounding the question. But you can ask a person, and by the way, every person has thought about death. Every person has thought about what happens after you die. They may not be forthcoming with what they think. They may not want to share that with you, but everybody has thought about that. Most people start thinking about this from the time that they are children. And they're pondering, okay, well, what is death? And what does that mean? And what happens after you die? And they've had very deep and serious thoughts about it. And obviously, depending on the answer that they give you, you can take that and then you can probe their understanding, and you can ask more follow-up questions, and you can have a really great spiritual discussion, which can lead into being able to share the gospel. So what I'm saying to you this morning is this: don't be afraid of trying. You say, well, I don't know how to have a spiritual conversation with someone. So here's my challenge to you. Just try. Just say, okay, Lord, I want to have a spiritual conversation with someone. Don't expect it to be easy or to be like, okay, I went and I asked a question and the person got saved at the end of that encounter. Or just expect, I'm going to go and I'm going to have this spiritual conversation. It's going to be a little awkward. It's going to be a little challenging. It might not quite end the way that I want it to end, but I'm going to try. I'm going to begin to try to develop this skill of having a spiritual conversation with someone. You will be shocked at the conversations that you can have with people all around you. People that you've thought they're not interested, they wouldn't have the slightest interest in knowing any more about you. You would be shocked what is going on in people's minds and hearts. And so I want to encourage you, ask God today, Lord, this week, would you give me an opportunity to have a spiritual conversation? Help me to tune my ears and my heart to what's going on in the world around me, and then give me the courage, the boldness to step forward and engage someone with a spiritual conversation when you open that door. And by faith, believe that God is going to lead you to that opportunity this week. I guarantee that you will be surprised. God will open more doors of opportunity than you ever realized were there. And I think many times we're just not paying attention to what God is doing all around us, and we're missing out on those chances to be able to speak to people about the things of the Lord.